I was kind of caught off guard. I didn't know they were behind me. I thought that was for me. So a little deflated here. But I'm Steve Ford, President Ford's third son and chairman of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation. Glad to be here, and I want to thank the Amway Hotel and the Voss family for hosting us here, having the Vice President and Liz, his daughter, with us. Mr. Vice President, I don't know what to say about your bio. You've had almost every government job there is. We all know about that and your fine service to this country. Let me speak from a son of a former president who, last night we hosted Frank Czar over at the museum. We were talking about what this country looked like back in 1974 when my dad took over the reins of this nation. And we had a war in Vietnam, we had a country that was in crisis, a president who had resigned, a Cold War with the Russians, a recession like we'd never seen before, 14% inflation, 8-9% unemployment, energy crisis, Cold War with the Russians, the list goes on and on. I remember standing on that front lawn and as the Nixon helicopter took off. And it was a constitutional crisis. First man to become president of the United States that had not gone through a general election was going to walk in there, put his hand on the Bible, take the oath of office. And I can tell you as a citizen, and also as Gerald Ford's son, I am very, very, very grateful that this man right here was there to help my father through that situation. Sir, without saying anything else, welcome to Grand Rapids. Thank you from our family, everybody. We are so grateful that you were such a close personal friend and confidant and advisor to both my dad and mom. Thank you, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. And we are delighted to be back in Grand Rapids. Have the opportunity to spend some time talking about the book that Liz and I wrote together. I used to brag when people would ask me if I was ever going to do a book, and I always say, look, I wouldn't have the job I've got now if I'd written about the last job I had. But after I finished being Vice President for 8 years, looked back over what had started out to be 12 months in Washington and turned out to be about 40 years. I decided that it was time. I was approaching age 70, and if I was ever going to do it, now was the time. And I also thought about it in terms of wanting to leave behind a historical account from the standpoint of my kids and grandkids. That 50 years from now, a child or one of my descendants was curious about how I spent my life, but find things right there, and courtesy of Simon & Schuster. And so I decided that I would do the book, and a number of publishers were interested. So one thing led to another, and Liz and I signed on. Liz is my principal co-author, and we signed a contract a little over 2 years ago with Simon & Schuster, and then worked very hard for the next 2 years. The book is what's emerged out of all of that. Now, I went through a brief period there last year where I was incapacitated for quite some time for health reasons. Liz was able, with all the material I'd already given her, to keep cranking away on the book, but she very much had a major hand in what we produced here. One of the great pleasures of the whole enterprise has been having a child. I think it was a child. She's got 5 of her own now. But to have a family member that close who is willing to spend all that time listening to me tell old war stories, which she did. And we captured them and put them in the book. There are some we left out.
For the next one.
For the next one. But what we ordinarily do, what I'd like to do today, is have Liz interview. In fact, she knows the material in the book better than anybody else. She also refuses to follow the script. I never know what she's going to ask about. And we'll do that for a while and then open it up. You have to take some questions from the audience. Everybody that is, except except. So with that, Liz, it's all yours.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having us, and it's been a tremendous blessing for me to be able to work on this project with my dad, and not at all difficult to sit and listen to his stories because he's got so many and they're very interesting. And it gave me the excuse to be able to probe and really ask questions about things he had not wanted to talk about before. And so one of those stories is the place that I'd like to start this afternoon. And that is on July 28, 1963, in a jail cell in Rock Springs, Wyoming. And this was the second time my dad had found himself in jail in a year. And the thing that is truly amazing, though, is a mere 12 years later, from that moment in 1963, he was the youngest chief of staff in history for President Gerald R. And I think that everybody who understands that story wants to know the same thing, which is, how the hell did that happen?
Well, the fact was, when I got out of high school, I'd been recruited to go to Yale. Family didn't have any money, so they offered me a full financial backing as well. And I went off to New Haven. I didn't do very well at New Haven. And the second time they kicked me out, they told me not to come back. And so I went west, went back out to Wyoming. I got a ticket in the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers the summer I got out of high school. And I spent my time building power line, transmission line, laying cable between missile silos, Warren Air Force Base, building power plants, coal fire plants, and so forth. Very thick. For about 6 years when I was in school office. I was out working in the tools, so to speak. And that was a lifestyle that frankly I enjoyed. I had an old 1949 Chevrolet and one suitcase with everything around it. I was free to pick up and go anytime I wanted. I didn't have any obligations to anybody. And stayed in hotels at about $10 to $15 a week. Life was good for a 19, 20-year-old who didn't know anything. And I ended up, because we used to, after work, we'd go back into town and consume vast quantities of beer. That was, not a lot of other things you could do in small towns in Wyoming. But anyway, that summer of 1963, as my classmates at Yale were all graduating, going on to law school or to good jobs, and my bride-to-be, she hadn't agreed yet at that point, but she was graduating summa cum laude, magna cum laude.
Whatever it's like.
She was the number one in the class from Colorado College, and I was sleeping off a hang in Rock Springs Jail. And I can smile about it now, but at the time, it suddenly dawned on me. It was the second time, less than a year when I found myself in similar circumstances, that if I stayed in the road I was on, I was going to come to a bad end, and that I really needed to clean up my act, see if I could make something of myself. And so I did. I went back to work, and I stayed out on the job. We were going 80 miles of line from Rock Springs and Flaming Gorge Reservoir, Colorado River, right along the Utah border. And I found that if I didn't go to bars, I could get into trouble. I slept out on the job with another guy for the rest of the summer. And then that fall started school at the University of Wyoming. Worked hard for a year. It turned out I was a pretty good student. I applied myself. I got part-time work that, together with my savings this summer, I could pay my own way. And so a year later, then finally we married. And we just finished celebrating our 47th wedding anniversary. And I must admit, she had a lot to do with my coming to understand why it was vital for me to change my lifestyle. But over the course of the next few years, I earned a bachelor's degree, master's degree at Wyoming. Went to Wisconsin, worked for the governor there for a year. I picked up fellowships along the way, internships where I started working first in Wyoming State Senate, then for the governor of Wisconsin, and eventually got a fellowship to go back to Washington for a year. And in Washington, I ran into a guy named Don Rumsfeld. And Rumsfeld was the young congressman then from the North Shore of Chicago. He came and spoke to the group of congressional fellows that I was part of. We all had stipends, so we were free help as members of Congress, but we went and negotiated your own arrangement where you would work. And I was very impressed with Rumsfeld when he spoke to the group, so I made an appointment to go see him for the job. And the appointed hour, walked in, was introduced to him, sat down across the desk from him, and in about 10 minutes I was back out in the hallway. I just sort of got started in this field, working on my PhD in science, roll call, voting analysis in the House and Senate, and he doesn't know all that. This isn't going to work. So yeah, I got him to treat him like that. Well, not since I got out of jail. He ended up, a couple months later, he was nominated by President Nixon to run the anti-poverty for the Wealth of Economic Opportunity. And I sat down one night unsolicited. I was working with another congressman by the name of Bill Steiger from Wisconsin. I sat down and wrote an unsolicited 12-page memo telling him how he ought to conduct himself as a commissioner and what he ought to do with the agency. This morning, his agenda, what the issues were that he needed to address. I didn't hear any more about it. Bill passed the memo on to Rumsfeld. The last I heard of it, a couple of weeks later, when he got confirmed in the Senate, and then I got a phone call inviting me to come down to the agency the next day, which would be his first day on the job. And they were going to get a bunch of people together and start working on the transition. Sure. So I went down. Rumsfeld came and spoke to a group of about 50 of us left. And then the secretary came in. And she said, "Is there somebody in here named Cheney?" And I held my hand up. And she said, "Come with me." Took me in the back office there, back into the corner suite where the director's office was. And you could tell it was a poverty agency. The roof was leaky, and fans around the floor to catch the rain. It was all beat up. And Don was working at the desk, and he looked up, saw me, he said, "You're congressional relations." And I get the hell out of here. He didn't say, "Would you like a job?" Or, "I'm sorry I threw you out the last time." Or, "I really like the memo that you wrote." You're congressional relations, now lead it. And so I went out in the hallway and asked for congressional relations. And they told me, and I went down and took over congressional relations. Mind you, I'm still being paid by the foundation for working up on Capitol Hill, probably illegal appointee in the executive branch. We got that all sorted out. And one thing led to another, and he eventually hired me as his top assistant there at the Hill. He also had a White House job. When that happened, I obviously made decisions in Washington political work for a while. But one of the things that went with that was a full-field FBI investigation. And I had to have a security clearance and to get a White House pass. So after that investigation had been completed, he called me in one day. He said, "Do you have an arrest record?" I said, "Yes, I do." He said, "Did you put it on your form, your appointment form?" And he signed up. And I said, "Yes, I did." And so he called for the secretary to bring in the form, brought it in, he looked at it, and been very careful and was scrupulously honest and accurate in what I filed. And he read it and then closed it up and said, okay, that's good enough for me. And I was hired. He could have had anybody he wanted for that job. I was the youngest member of the cabinet at that time. Mid to late 30s. There were people all over town screaming to go to work for God Rumsfeld in the kind of position he was hired for. We didn't have any spots or blemishes of any kind. And it Rumsfeld picked me. And a few years later, when Jerry Ford became president, by then I worked 4 years with Don in the Nixon administration and was working with a private firm here in Washington. And Rumsfeld got sent back from NATO by President Ford to help the transition, run the transition from the Nixon to Ford administration. I met him out at the airport on August 9th, the day that President Ford was sworn in. And we drove to the White House, and in Brew, he asked me if I'd sign on and work for him during this transition, as you mentioned. And I remember driving to the southwest gate of the White House that afternoon. By this time, meetings were starting, Nixon's left, and Jerry Ford's in charge. And thinking that it was a horrendous task managing this transition, this constitutional crisis, but also thinking of Rumsfeld. It's young and foolish that they could do anything. And so we signed on to the Senate. But obviously, I didn't even know the security clearance. And yet, I went to look again diligently. And lo and behold, we started on And when it came at that time, Don talked to the president about it. And the president basically reacted the same way Don did. He said, look, Don, he said, it's good enough for you. I'll take it. And so they signed me out to do it. And it fundamentally changed my life. Everything that's happened to me since, I can trace back to those days, especially when I was making a decision, ultimately, I was marched to government and politics, and I was teaching about it. And I ran into two very remarkable men who gave me tremendous opportunities. Ron Russell and Jerry Ford.
You worked for the 5 Republican presidents since Dwight Eisenhower. You worked for Ford and worked very closely with Ronald Reagan when you were in House leadership. And every other stop we've made on this book tour, you've declined to say which of those presidents you admire most. But I suspect it would be accurate to say, because I'm trying not to put you on the spot here, that there is none you admire more than Jerry Ford. And I thought it might be nice, and I'm sorry to tell you about this ahead of time, but to have you obviously talk about President Ford, but there's a story you tell in the book about going to see him in Philadelphia after you became vice president, the vice presidential nominee. And then maybe read the word you spoke because you because it really tells what kind of man it was, what kind of relationship it was.
Okay. Sorry to share this. Like this. But, no, I remember it very well. It was, I was in Philadelphia in 2000 because then Governor Bush picked me to be his running mate. And as I say here, there were many amazing moments during the Philadelphia convention. One was when I went with my daughter Mary, Liz's sister, who had agreed to serve as my personal assistant during the campaign. And we went to visit my old boss, President Gerald R. As we arrived in his suite, the 87-year-old former president walked over to Mary, put his arm around her, and said, "I bet you're proud of your dad, right?" "Yes, sir, Mr. President," she replied. "I sure am." "Good," he said. "Me too." If it hadn't been for President Ford and the trust in placing me a quarter century before, I wouldn't have been Republican nominee for vice president, and I was grateful for the opportunity to thank him personally. The day after Mary and I visited him, he was hospitalized having suffered a stroke. He would live 6 more years, time deeply valued by those of us who loved him. And when he died, it was my great and sad honor as Vice President to eulogize him in the Capitol Rotunda. I remembered his brief presidency, just 895 days, as a time filled with testing and trial, enough for a longer stay. Even then, amid troubles not of his own making, President Ford proved as worthy of that office as any who had ever come before. He was modest and manful. There was confidence and courage in his bearing. His judgment, he was sober and serious, unafraid of decisions, calm and steady by nature, always the still point in the turning wheel. A man who never assumed airs and was known for his kindness, Gerald Ford led our nation through one of the greatest constitutional crises in our history. I think that's it.
Now, I've often wondered how it was, though, that he placed such trust in you. Not to take anything away from you. But there was a moment when you had the opportunity to introduce him to your own parents. Mm-hmm. And I think it was telling.
Yeah. Well, when I went to work, I went to work as the Deputy Chief of Staff. Rumsfeld was the Chief of Staff at the outset. And then about a year later, the President made some more changes. Where Rumsfeld went off to defense, and I took over in the White House. But I can remember the day my parents showed up to visit, and I took them into the Oval Office to meet the President of the United States. You talk about two people surprised what had happened to me in my life. You know, it's like I had to prove it. And honestly, it's really the President. So we went in, and we had a great time. Still got a picture of the President meeting with my folks and our two girls, Liz and Mary, and Lynn, we were all there. And spent about a half hour. He was very generous with his time and so forth. Had a great chat. Then they left, and that night I went back in. Session we used to have at the end of every day. We'd go in and spend maybe 20 or 30 minutes with the President. He'd unload things he wanted me to do. I'd talk to him about scheduling and other matters we were dealing with. And when I went in that night, he couldn't get over how well preserved my dad was. And he kept talking. He said, "Yeah, gee, your dad really is good for a guy his age. And he's really held up amazingly well." Well, the truth was, my folks were both younger than the President. And he didn't know that when he hired me. But eventually he got it figured out. I was a little bit on the green side, but he never let that stop. So, place that he said. The one thing he did do, though, I remember this on a number of occasions, after I got to be Vice President, he used to take great delight in telling me that the worst job he ever had in his life were the 8 months he spent as Vice President. He'd bring it up whenever he found the opportunity to do that.
When you left your job as Chief of Staff, you did something that surprised a lot of people. You went back to Wyoming and ran for Congress. And I know you talk in the book about people saying to you, why in the world would you want to go from being one of the most powerful positions in Washington in the country to running for the job of sole representative, becoming a junior House member from Wyoming? Talk about why you made that decision. It's pretty surprising.
After I'd worked around the President, and having been associated also with Rumsfeld and Bill Steiger from Wisconsin, some of you may remember, I decided that after the Ford administration ended, that what I really wanted to do was go home and run for office, and that I wanted to put my own name on the ballot. And I had an opportunity to stay in Washington and sort of become permanent part of the Washington establishment, but that I really wanted to be in a position where if I succeeded or failed in the political arena, it would be because I won or lost an election. And I liked the idea very much of being part of that amazing constitutional process we established as a nation, where we picked our leadership, and you had to go out and earn the right to cast that vote on behalf of your constituents, in your state or your congressional district. And the place for me to do that clearly was Wyoming. That was home. That's where I'd grown up. So we went home to Wyoming and bought a house, got the kids enrolled in school, settled in. Folks were delighted to have us back that close. And I went down, after I'd been there just a short time, I went down to see our former governor, Stan Hathaway. Stan was a man who was revered in the state of Wyoming, and he gave me my first political job, so I went down to consult with him to see what he thought my prospects might be. And he was a lawyer at Cheyenne by then. And he asked me, he said, what are you going to do? I said, well, Governor, I'm thinking about running for that Senate seat that's coming open. Cliff Hansen had announced his retirement from the U.S. Senate. And he said, well, you could do that. You could run for that Senate seat. He said, of course, if you do, Al Simpson's going to kick your butt. Al Simpson was then Speaker of the State House of Representatives. When I leave here tomorrow, I'm going to go to Cody, Wyoming, where we're going to roast Al because he's retiring from the chairman of the board out there, and I'm going to get even for a lot of transgressions that he's committed over the years. But my Senate career lasted about 5 minutes. I decided, well, I'm not going to run against Al Simpson. So then the House seat came open. Tino Roncalio, a Democratic member, had been there for 10 years, but Tino announced his retirement, so I jumped into the race and campaigned for about 14 months. And everything went along fine until Father's Day, 1978, in June. We had a primary in August, and I had a tough three-way race for the nomination. But that June, I was down staying with friends in Cheyenne. Woke up in the middle of the night, about 2 o'clock in the morning, a tingling sensation in 2 fingers in my left hand. And I had a cousin over in Idaho who was a physician who just had a bad heart attack a few weeks before. And for whatever reason, I think that memory or my awareness of this situation, I decided I should go check it out, even though it was just 2 fingers in my left hand, kind of tingling, you know, like bump your elbow or something. And woke up our host, drove me to the hospital. I walked into the emergency room, Cheyenne Memorial, and passed out. I was having a heart attack. And that put a bit of a crimp in the operation in terms of my campaign. But I had a great doctor, internist, who was taking care of me. We didn't have a cardiologist in those days in Wyoming. And I asked the doctor, Rick Davis is his name, I asked him, Rick, I said, am I going to have to give up my campaign? Am I going to give up stresses and strains of a political career and go find something else to do? He said, look, Dick, he said, hard work never kill anybody. That was his advice. Now, I don't know if it was good medical advice, but it turned out to be good political advice. And so I took it easy for about a month. I can remember spending most of that under a tree in our backyard in Casper, reading Richard Nixon's memoirs that had just come out. A friend of mine had to write it, and he got me a copy of it. And Lynn went out and filled out a campaign trail for me, so we didn't miss any events. And we stayed in the race, and lo and behold, we won both the nomination and the general election. But I always thought I was going to be a man of the house for the rest of my career, and I went to Washington with that intention. So 10 years altogether before I got pulled out of the House by George Bush 41. But I love the House of Representatives. I'm sorry these days when Congress is held in not very high regard with some justification in terms of ongoing debates and problems we're having in terms of dealing with very different issues. But I really did love the House of Representatives, being Wyoming's congressman, being recognized as the gentleman from Wyoming. It was a great job.
I think I've given my dad my cold on this book tour. Normally, I jump ahead and ask you questions about the vice presidency, and we are going to take questions from the audience, and I'm sure there'll be questions about the vice presidency there, but sitting here where we are, I really think it would be interesting to talk about the 1976 presidential election, talk about President Ford some more, and your role in that election and the extent to which, it was the last truly contested convention going into it, and maybe also tell the story about the presidential debates.
Well, well, 76 was it's the last time we really had sort of a head-to-head of the nomination at the convention. Steve was there; he remembers all this. And it was Kansas City, and it was a remarkable battle. We had the struggle all the way down from New Hampshire all the way to the convention for uncommitted delegates. And we did everything we could to round up uncommitted delegates. We'd fly in a delegation from Pennsylvania in the afternoon, have cocktails with the president. We had get some delegate who kept switching sides to bring down her and her family, put them in the Oval Office, have the picture taken with the president. There wasn't anything we wouldn't do for an uncommitted delegate. We got down close to the convention, just a week or two before the convention. One night, late at night, an intruder climbed over the fence on the north side of the White House off Pennsylvania Avenue, carrying a length of pipe, and climbed over the fence and headed for the north portico. And the officer that was out there, uniformed Secret Service detail, hollered at him to stop. He wouldn't stop. Kept going, and he fired a warning shot, and the guy still wouldn't stop. So he did the only thing he could, and he shot him, dropped him dead on the north lawn of the White House. And there was, needless to say, chaos. Sirens going every place, and people running around. They got the officer who had done the shooting. He was fairly new to the force and was very shaken by this whole thing. Got him down in the Secret Service command post underneath the West Wing. And all of a sudden there was a moment of silence. You could hear a pin drop. And one of the senior agents leaning against the wall, watching all of this go on, said, "Gentlemen," he said, if that fellow we just shot was an uncommitted delegate, deep trouble. It was that kind of convention and campaign. When we got to Kansas City, we had the votes fight. It was a big fight over what we call 16C. Excuse me. Been talking to you.
You want a license?
Yeah. But we won the fight on what was called Rule 16C. This was sort of a surrogate issue over who was going to win the nomination. Ford forces won this fight over a procedural issue, and then all we had left that night, this is Tuesday night of the convention, was the platform. And ordinarily that should be a routine matter to just get the platform approved. And we demonstrated our strength and so forth. But there was a plank in the platform that was didn't mention anybody by name, but it was extremely critical of Henry Kissinger, his foreign policy. Henry was somewhat suspect in those days in the eyes of some of our conservative Republicans. And Jesse Helms had put together this platform plank and trying to get it passed. And what the Reagan forces were hoping for was that there would be a battle over this plank and that they could carry the day on that issue and reverse the momentum in the convention and maybe capture the nomination. So we had a big meeting up in President Ford's suite. And the president was there, and Henry Kissinger, Nelson Rockefeller, other staff people, Bill Timmons, Tom Corlovis, who've been with us a long time. And we were debating about what we should do, and Henry was insisting that we had to fight that platform fight. That it was just a terrible insult. Henry doesn't even mention it. Yeah, but I mean, everybody knows what it's about. It would make it impossible for him to function as Secretary of State if we didn't fight that platform fight and defeat it, take it out of there. And our guys were saying, look, Henry, our delegates are in bars all over Kansas City. They think the fight's over for the night. And if we force it to a vote, we could lose. And we could turn around the the dynamics of the convention here and we'd be in big trouble. And Henry responded, he said, look, he said, if you don't fight this platform plank and get it out of there, I'm going to quit. I'm going to resign. And it was quiet for a moment. And then Tom Korlotis, big Greek lobbyist guy who's still back there in Washington now, said, well, for crying out loud, Henry, if you're going to quit, do it now. We need to vote back. It was one of those moments, even Henry had to laugh. Needless to say, he didn't resign. We accepted the plank and a voice vote, and nobody even remembered the next day. It barely made newspapers. But it was a classic case where taking a dive was the right thing to do, the right answer. You had something else you wanted to read?
Well, I think the debates.
Oh, the debates are, of course, the presidential debates were unique in those days. Now you can't turn on the television without seeing a presidential debate. Everybody, I think, gets a little tired. The 14th week in a row when there's a debate going on, but there hadn't been any debates except for the Nixon-Kennedy debates in 1960. By the time you get to 1976, it was not routine, especially for an incumbent president, to agree to share the stage with his child. You shouldn't do that. But we were behind in the polls significantly coming out of the Democratic convention. And we came up with the idea, and the president loved it, that he could challenge Jimmy Carter to a debate and make it part of his acceptance speech in Kansas City, which we did. And agreed to 3 debates. And the one that was most controversial was the second one in San Francisco that dealt with foreign policy. And we got into a situation. Max Frankel of the New York Times asked the question. I can't even remember the exact language he used now, but it basically challenged the president on the Helsinki Accords, where we in effect had put the human rights issues and so forth front and center, subject that was going to be debated and a legitimate subject for negotiation in our dealings with the communist bloc. And the president responded very aggressively, but came across as saying that Poland's not dominated by the Soviet Union. So the operative phrase. Max Frankel gave him a chance to clean it up, came back and hit it again, and the president hit it even harder. And but other than that, it was a flawless performance. Never missed a lick. And the poll that we were doing that night, we had polls in the field, the public never picked up on it. But by the next day, the press had started to work it over. And the Carter campaign had it. So it was hammering us on the grounds that the president wasn't sort of up to speed on the fact that the Soviet Union occupied Eastern Europe. It was an outrageous charge, but they were playing it, which kept us off message. The next morning, we got in the airplane to fly to Los Angeles for a couple of days of campaigning in Southern California. And members, we took off from San Francisco. I went up to the cabin on Air Force One, the president's cabin, and said, Mr. President, I really think we need to clean this up. It's very important here. Take advantage of the opportunity as early as we can today. Make the point that you misspoke. That happens to everybody. And let's get on with it. Not worry about it. We got to put it behind us. And he didn't want to hear it. He argued with me about it. So I went back and got reinforcements. Stu Spencer, who was a political guru from California, took Stu up with me, and we both hit him on it, and he threw both of us out. Got on down to Southern California, and he made a couple of half-hearted attempts to try to clear the air, but all it did was just sort of feed the press frenzy out there. They were going nuts. They were having so much fun. And we finally ended up over in Glendale, the big rally there outside City Hall. And the president spoke. I'd been out mixing and mingling with the press, and they were beside themselves. They were so happy. They ignored the speech and started hammering away again on how many Soviet tanks are there, all that kind of thing. So we got the president back into the mayor's office, and Stu and I went in again and sat down, and said, look, Mr. President, we really got this cleaned up. Stu and I are just getting hammered from the home office back in Washington. And everybody's saying you got to go out and make sure everybody understands, the President knows the Soviets still dominate Eastern Europe. And finally he said, oh, all right, I'll do it. And we got the press off the press bus and put them in the parking lot out back at City Hall. And I'm all lined up for an impromptu press conference by the President. And then we got word that everything had been set up. So we started out, the President was going out first, and I was right behind him, and then Stu was right behind me. And as we were headed out the door, I said to him, now have you got firmly fixed in your mind, Mr. President, what it is you want to say? And he spun around on his heel, jabbed his finger in my chest, and said, Poland is not dominated by the Soviet Union. I faded. I just totally took me out. And then he laughed like that. And he knew exactly what he was going to do. And he went out and did a beautiful job. But he was going to get one more laugh before we were finished. He could. I'd heard stories over the years that Jerry Ford had a temper. I rarely saw it. But you could always tell when he would get close because he'd get these red spots on his cheeks and under his eyes. And Steve probably saw him a time or two.
I do want to ask one question about the Vice Presidency to dispel a myth, which is the myth that you were really running the show. The idea that you were somehow behind the scenes orchestrating things so that you were actually the president during those 8 years. And normally when I hear this charge or this allegation, it's from people who do not know that your dog was banned from one of the main buildings at Camp David. And that if in fact you'd been in charge, certainly you could have prevented your dog.
Well, first of all, the charge was totally false. It was brought up periodically from time to time. There was never any question about who was president of the United States. It was George Bush, and I was privileged to serve as his vice president. And he allowed me to have my say on whatever issue I wanted to have my say on, but he always made the decision. There was never any doubt in the operation about who was running the show. But the story about Camp David is an interesting one, in that after 9/11, Secret Service became very concerned about not having the president and a bunch of them in the same location. They didn't want to have a decapitation strike where you'd lose both the president and vice president at the same time. So I spent a lot of time at so-called secure, undisclosed locations. One of the places we used to go was up to Camp David, which was a nice place. You had to be banished in some place. Camp David did that. But the practice was, when we went up there, we'd often take our dog, a big golden lab, weighed about 100 pounds, named Dave. Now, Dave was actually Liz's dog. Liz had acquired him originally, but Liz had one of these.
I'm going to stop asking you to tell this story if you just started this way every time.
Liz had one of these electric fences buried in the ground, and you put a deal on the dog's collar. The dog quickly learns that he tries to go through that fence, he gets zapped. So they don't do that, it keeps him penned in. The problem, Liz also had a growing family, and lots of times she would, because she's got 3 kids she's trying to get squared away and strapped in their seats. She'd put Dave in the back end of her station wagon, her SUV, and then get in the car and take off and forget to turn off the car. And so you drive through that fence, David gets zapped. Well, we moved into the Vice President's residence, which is a beautiful home down in Massachusetts Avenue there in Washington, and a big 12-acre compound that we lived in. And Liz one day came down there with the kids and dogs. And after she got ready to go home, Dave wouldn't get in the SUV. And he was slow, but he wasn't stupid. He figured out what his problem was. And so he defected. He liked that 12 acres down there, had a lot of nice squirrels to chase, people to look after him and so forth, and there was no electric fence. Well, they brought Dave up to Camp David frequently with us when we go up there, and he'd stay with us at camp, Lynn and I. And one morning we were up there, we were going to have a National Security Council meeting at Camp David at Laurel Lodge. Laurel is the big main lodge on the camp. It's where there's a dining facility, cabinet room, office for the president, and so forth. And Dave got on the golf cart with me. We all drew golf carts up there. And I tooled on down to Laurel Lodge. And we got off the golf cart, walked into the lodge. As we went through the front door, the dining room's off over here to the left. There were a couple of cabinet wives sitting in there having breakfast at that point. And Dave's trotting along the side, and all of a sudden, he spots Barney. Now, Barney, of course, is the president's little black Scotty that had been given to him as a gift by Governor Whitman from New Jersey. And Barney maybe weighed, 8 or 10 pounds. He wasn't close to 100 pounds. And he looked a lot like a squirrel. And Dave loved to chase squirrels. And he never, I don't think I ever saw him catch one, but he sure had fun chasing. But, and Barney, the other thing to say about Barney was Barney was mean. There was more than one official in our administration who had to get stitches in his anatomy before he left after he'd been on a visit. But anyway, Barney took off, tearing around the table with Dave in hot pursuit. And lumping along, and the dogs running like crazy. And then all of a sudden, the president stepped in, and he said, "What the hell is going on here?" Which, when you think about it, was not an unreasonable question. And I figured out right away that I had a problem. So I grabbed the pastry off the pastry tray and hollered, "Dave, treat." One thing Dave liked more than chasing squirrels was food. And so he immediately stopped, and I got him pastry and then got him by the collar and hauled out the front door of the Laurel. We got back on the golf cart, and I went back over to the cabin where Lynn and I were staying. Been there about 15 minutes, there's a knock at the door. And I opened the door, and there is the camp commander, a Navy captain, in his full dress uniform. And he said, "Mr. Vice President, sir," he said, "until further notice, your dog is banished from Laurel." If anybody ever had any question about who was running the show, it wasn't me.
All right, one last question before we take audience questions, and that is, if you could tell us, what is the best job you ever had? And then maybe end with this invocation.
Well, it's interesting. I think about it. I'm often asked that question about all the different jobs. Each one was, each situation was unique. And as a student of political science, I used to think about it as trained, sort of look for the common threads and themes across administration. What kind of problems does every president have, and so forth. And what I found after I'd been there all those years and actually operating in different administrations was that an awful lot turned on the president's experience, and they all had a wide variety of experiences before they got there, but also on the problems they were forced to deal with. And it was rare that a president ended up spending his time, once he got into office, on what he thought he was going to spend his time on before he got there. In second Bush administration, the president had an agenda on tax policy and education and immigration, a lot of issues that he dealt with as governor of Texas and thought needed addressed. And while we worked some on those, once 9/11 came, we were consumed by the war on terror, being certain that we didn't get hit again. I think about George Bush 41, we ended up in a situation where when he interviewed me for the job, we talked about procurement reform in the Pentagon and how we were going to make the department more efficient and save money and so forth. And of course, in fact, what happened was the Soviet Union collapsed, the Berlin Wall came down, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, we sent $500,000 men to the Gulf in Operation Desert Storm. I hadn't planned on that. The thing that struck me, and one that I think historically was, those were not insignificant problems to deal with by any means, but the problems that Jerry Ford faced when he became president, an office he never saw. I think he and Betty had been talking about possible retirement before he actually became vice president and then president. And I don't know how you could match that set of experiences with anything any other president ever had to deal with. Because all of a sudden there he was, the President of the United States. As Steve mentioned in his introduction, he had all of those big problems to wrestle with. It also was true that we were young, I guess is the way I put it. I don't know what your experiences are, but I think it'd be fair to say in my case, I remember those experiences from my early days when everything was new and fresh, and I thought I could do anything. That sticks with you. It's friendships and people you deal with becomes lifelong relationships. And I can still, to this day, remember some of those events better than I can ones I participated in 6 or 7 years ago. And so with all that as qualifier, I also had the privilege, and this was always very special, working closely with the United States military on many occasions, Secretary of Defense, while I was Vice President, while I was on the Intelligence Committee, for example, in Congress and so forth. And I never failed to be amazed at the capabilities, dedication, service, the competence of our men and women in uniform. Those years spent with them on their behalf as part of that operation, part of the civilian leadership for the Department of Defense, will always stand out in my mind as very special parts of my career. What Liz wanted me to do, excuse me, was there was a group of we refer to as special operators. People like SEAL 26, they've got Osama bin Laden back in May, Delta, Army Forces, Task Force 160. They don't talk about what they do for good and sufficient reason, but they are some of our absolute finest soldiers, sailors you're ever going to meet. They're really phenomenal. It's extraordinarily difficult, one, to get into those units, but two, what we expect from them is amazing. And someday the whole story will be told about Iraq and Afghanistan and other things I've been involved with over the years. But when it is told, the men and women of our Special Operations Forces will be properly teaching. But some of them invited Lynn and I and Liz to have dinner with them. And on a special occasion here in 2008, which was the last year we were in office. So we went down and spent an amazing evening with these guys and their spouses. And there was an invitation delivered that day at dinner that I've never forgotten. I mentioned in the book by their chaplain, who happened to be a young man from Wyoming. And it goes as follows. It's very brief. We are soldiers, God, agents of correction. May our world see the power of faith. May our nation know the strength of selfless service. And may our enemies continue to taste the inescapable force of freedom. That says it all.
Thank you. I think we're going to do some audience questions now. I don't know if there is a microphone right there and one over there as well. So if you have a question, if you just would like to raise your hand, and feel free to ask them about anything that I missed.
President Cheney, thanks so much for being here today. I'm part of a fortunate group of public policy students from down the road at the University of Michigan Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy that have daily opportunities to analyze public policies, recommendations that are both made to congressional members and presidents. And one of the things that we quickly learn is that no matter how tight our analysis is, or just how much we can reference a specific statute or a certain economic benefit to a policy, we learn that it takes a certain amount of negotiation skills and persuasion strategies to truly be able to implement one's own agenda. So one of the things that I wanted to ask, both for my personal benefit and for a lesson that I'd like to take back to my colleagues at the School of Public Policy, is what is one of the skills that you've picked up during your life when it comes to these tough negotiations or these tough persuasions that you've undertaken that doesn't necessarily come with tight analysis or very convincing policy arguments? That is, what is one of these tactics and strategies that you've learned that comes with the experience of being in politics and working in policy over the course of a lifetime?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think I'm going to tell a story about Ronald Reagan at this point. I remember I was always struck by particular incidents that occurred when I was in the House during the Reagan years when President Reagan was pushing a tax reform package. And he had they put together the package. My friend Jim Baker, who worked with us in the Ford administration and then worked for President Reagan, was heavily involved. He was Treasury Secretary then. And this was a situation in which the Democrats controlled the House, the Republicans controlled the Senate, and controlled the White House. But they sent the tax bill up from downtown, and it went through the Democratic Ways and Means Committee in the House, and what came out of there, we House Republicans didn't like. I mean, it was a mess. And our friends downtown, Reagan White House, said, well, go ahead and vote for it anyway, you guys. We know you don't like it, but we'll send it over to the Republican Senate, and they'll clean it up. And we didn't like that. We didn't like the idea of having to vote for a bad bill, what we thought was a bad bill. So when the bill came up, we defeated the rule under which it was to be considered. So they never could bring it out on the floor because we killed the rule. And that put a stop to the tax reform effort at that point, which, needless to say, created consternation in the White House downtown. So we got a phone call saying the president wanted to come up and talk to his wayward Republicans. And we scheduled the session. And in the meantime, there had been a terrible accident. A plane load of our soldiers, 101st, crashed in Canada, coming back for duty in the Sinai. That particular day that the president was coming to the Hill, he first had to go down to Fort Campbell, Kentucky, and preside at a memorial service for those who'd been lost in that plane accident. And so he came back to Washington, came straight to Capitol Hill, and we were in one of those big committee rooms over on the Rayburn House office building. And had all of the House Republicans there, probably maybe 180 of us, pretty good sized group. And he walked in and proceeded to talk about that memorial service and to talk about what sacrifice meant and patriotism and what it meant to be an American. It was a kind of very, very moving, very emotional speech. And when he finished, then he stopped and he paused, and everybody there had been touched by the emotion of the moment. And then he said, now, gentlemen, he said, about that tax bill. He didn't say a word about what was in the bill. He didn't talk about what we'd done to it or anything. All he said was, now, gentlemen, about that tax bill. And everybody jumped up and started saying, we're with you, Mr. President. You can count on us, Mr. President. 70 votes turned around just like that. They took it back to the floor of the House that afternoon passed. And I don't know how much he knew about what was in the tax bill, but it didn't matter. He picked his moment and understood, obviously, the enormous symbolic authority, if you will, under those circumstances of the president, and achieved an important policy objective. So, not everybody, obviously, is blessed with those talents. Jerry Ford had enormous capabilities in the congressional area because he's been one of them for so long. And, because he'd been on the Appropriations Committee for 25 years and knew everything there was to know, for example, about the defense bill.
One of the things that clearly comes through in your book that President Ford demonstrated as well is the importance of keeping your word, being known as a man of your word. When you think about things like negotiating defense budgets with, then Congressman Murtha, even people you disagreed with, being able to know that you could count on them or they could count on you to do what you said you were going to do. In addition to the pure political skill, I'm just helping you with the answer a little bit.
Are you trying to point me in a certain direction?
How did you talk about it?
Okay.
Anybody else? Back there?
Thank you for taking my question. I'm Casey Hoffman. I'm a student in the Gerald R. Ford Institute for Leadership in Public Policy and Service at Albion College. My question is about Dick Cheney, the husband, Dick Cheney, the father. You had mentioned previously that one of the worst mistakes the Kerry Edwards campaign could have made was making your wife upset. And I'd like to know about the effect that the vice presidency has had on your family and specifically your daughter Mary.
Okay. Well, the situation that he's referring to occurred in the 2004 election and debate that I had with John Edwards, who was my debating opponent, and later something that John Kerry had said. They both made reference to their daughter Mary, who's gay, and tried to use that fact as a political argument against President Bush and myself. And I was offended. I'd never before seen somebody try to use a child of a candidate in that way to try to score some kind of political points. But what happened was that they had their campaign manager went on television then right after the debate and was quoted as saying that Mary was, quote, fair game. This is my daughter. And when did she become fair game in the course of presidential campaign? Well, that made my wife angry. And if you've ever been involved on the other side of a campaign with Lynn, you don't want to make her angry. And we went down that night. We had to go down, and after the Bush-Kerry debate, which is where that statement was made, and she wasn't supposed to speak, but she got to the microphone before I could, and laid them out, and it was pretty effective. We thereafter, we actually got a bounce in the polls that we attributed to the fact that Mary had become a central issue, and we called it the Mary Cheney bounce. Still around the House, we label it as that. Family becomes extraordinarily important, obviously, in a political career, and I've seen it affect different families in different ways. In the case, sometimes families don't prosper in a political environment, or it just gets too tough, and the price that has to be paid for the principle to be active politically, and the long hours, the travel, and the fact that you're oftentimes going to be maligned in the newspaper by your opponents. Sometimes that just doesn't work. It's not a good, healthy environment. And in our case, the way it worked basically was that the whole enterprise was a family enterprise. That when the four of us get together, now, Liz and Mary and Lynn and I, we always end up telling old war stories about the campaigns of the past. Usually the ones where we had train wrecks, because they're the funniest. And I always felt blessed in the sense that my wife and daughters were very much on board. There were varying degrees of commitment. I can remember when I got word that George Bush might pick me to be vice president. We were living in Dallas, and I went home that night, and I said to the family, Liz was there for some reason, Lynn, said, honey, sell the house, I quit my job, I'm going back into politics. And this is after I had a great job running the private sector. And Lynn wasn't too sure whether or not that was a good idea, nor was Mary. Liz was out in the backyard painting yard signs already. She was committed. But both Liz and Mary and Lynn, they all played very important roles in my campaigns. Lynn is a surrogate for me when I got sick in the campaign. Liz was the in charge of things like debate preparation. And when I get ready for the vice presidential debate, she was the go-to person for all of that. Organized it, put together the briefing books, put together the practice sessions and everything. And really was my debate coach both in 2000 and 2004. Daughter Mary in 2000 was my aide-de-camp, traveled with me wherever I went. And then also in 2004, she took over and ran all of the operations at the campaign headquarters that dealt with the vice presidential campaign. So it's always been a joint venture. It would have been difficult to do any other way. I always felt to some extent that's the way the Ford operation worked as well too. That everybody was on board and doing everything possible to move the ball down the field. And they were great role models for us.
I think we could do one more question.
Back there.
Mr. Vice President, I've admired your eloquence and your elegance for a long time, and I see some of that now in Liz as she makes appearances on Fox News and other places. Obviously, it runs in the blood. What I'd like to do is ask you, who did you ever confront or go head-to-head with, someone from a different political persuasion that you enjoyed the verbal sparring most with?
You know the answer.
Yeah.
Well, I think back to my days in the House, and there were some members on the other side of the aisle that often disagreed with me, that we would do battle in a political sense. But two that come immediately to mind. One was Tom Foley from Washington State, who became Speaker. And Tom and I had similar districts, just hit it off and traveled together sometimes. And it was just a special, comfortable relationship. And a lot of people have good relationships with Speaker Foley, obviously. But the other one that was most productive in a sense was Jack Murphy from Pennsylvania. Jack was the chairman for years of the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee in the House. And when he wasn't chairman, when we Republicans controlled things, then he'd be the senior Democrat. Now, I never got to serve in the House when we Republicans were in the majority. But Jack was the kind of guy, he was a Vietnam vet, Marine, had worked his way up through the committee. And if Jack got behind something, it was going to pass. He was very close to Speaker O'Neill. He and I would get together and have breakfast the beginning of each legislative session. When I was Secretary of Defense, we'd sit down in my office down in the Pentagon, and on the back of an envelope, we would pencil in what it was he needed to get the bill passed and that he wanted to support up on the Hill, and what I needed, sort of what the must-dos were on both sides. And then that would be guidance for us. It was no more than that, no more than a handshake and breakfast. I paid for breakfast. But if you go back then at the end of the session, several months later, after we passed the Defense Appropriations Bill, which was an absolutely crucial piece of legislation, and check it against that envelope we'd put together at the beginning of the session, it would fit almost perfectly. He got what he needed, I got what I needed. We knew what the bottom line was for both of us, and I think the country was well served by it. I can remember a time when Jack took the Defense Appropriations Bill to the floor, and it was billions and billions of dollars. It was a big budget, biggest it was. And he got passed on a voice vote with no objections by unanimous consent. So, if you did business with Jack, you were pretty solid. And we liked each other and got along very well. He died not long ago, but he was a superb member and a Democrat.
All right, well, thank you very much, everyone, for being here tonight. And it's been a pleasure. Buy some books.